Monotype.
Welcome to Behind the Font, a new miniseries for Monotype that explores some of the more challenging corners of the design industry. On our regular podcast, Creative Characters, we meet the people who use type to create amazing designs and memorable brands. But as any creative will tell you, there's a world of technical challenges that designers and type industry people face. Let me give you some examples. Let's say you're making a website and you want to make it accessible. How do you do that? Somebody hands you a EULA for fonts. Have you ever seen one before? Do you know what's in it? In each episode, we'll talk to an expert, someone who specializes in something that challenges creatives in their everyday work. And our goal is to make your workday a little bit easier and maybe take some of the mystery out of those confusing and occasionally less glamorous parts of your job. Today, we're going to start with a topic that gets brought up the most here at Monotype. It's something that causes a lot of anxiety and stress amongst creatives and non-creatives alike. So much that we maybe kind of seriously considered calling this episode Our Lawyers on the Phone and They Sound Upset.
I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
We're talking about font licensing. Font licensing is, at its most basic level, the legal rules around using someone else's type design. It's similar to music licensing or even licensing someone's name for a product like Air Jordan sneakers. We're going to tackle this topic in 3 parts. In this episode, part 1, we'll go through a bit of recent history to understand why font licenses exist and how they've evolved alongside the technological advancements of the last 40 years. In episode 2, which comes out next week, we'll dissect the elements of a typical license and help you understand what they cover and what you need to know before agreeing to one. And in our final episode, episode 3, which comes out in 2 weeks, we'll answer listener questions. So make sure you're taking notes. Now, who better to walk us through all this than our very own Vice President and Assistant General Counsel, Phil Carey-Bergren. Phil, welcome.
Thanks, Carl. Great to be here.
Before we start, we just want to make one thing clear. Phil is a lawyer, but he's not your lawyer. Nothing we discuss here should be taken as legal advice. We hope these episodes help clarify some common legal concepts, but please consult with your own attorney for legal advice on your particular scenario. Phil, I don't think there's a topic we get more questions about than font licensing. Why do you think that is?
Licenses in general are pretty complex documents, and there's a perception that they're written by lawyers, can only be read by lawyers, that they contain a lot of fine print, legal jargon, and I think some of that just makes people nervous.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like in my limited knowledge compared to yours, I think there's a concern that people don't know what they don't know, and so it's sort of paralyzing. Does that feel right to you?
100%. I work with a lot of people who are dealing with contracts, sometimes for the first time in their career. And there is a perception, I think, among the non-lawyer public that these contracts are indecipherable. And people tend to kind of just give up before they start. But I think you should give it a chance.
Our producer left us a funny note that since these documents are called EULAs, we should call this a departure into the EULA-verse. So what do you think about that?
We'll have to trademark it quickly before anyone else gets to it. It's available, by the way.
I'm sure it is.
I'm thinking about filing for it, to be honest.
Before we explore the EULA-verse, a quick request. Series like this can't happen without you, our listeners. If you're a designer or a creative professional with questions about font licensing or any other challenging area of your work, we want to hear from you. We're dedicating an entire episode to your font licensing questions, so send them to us at podcast@monotype.com, or you can record a voice memo and email it to us. We might even feature it on that upcoming episode. Okay, back to the show. So, Phil, how long have you been thinking about font licenses? Do lawyers dream of end-user license agreements?
Some lawyers do, probably. I mean, maybe more of a nightmare sometimes.
Before you came to Monotype, was it even on your radar that there was this whole world of licensing law around fonts?
Absolutely not. I definitely didn't realize that there was a font industry. So it was definitely brand new to me.
I imagine that's where a lot of our listeners at least start, where they go, this is a whole thing and you have to pay for these. And there's a whole legal structure around this industry.
Yeah, totally. So I'm old. I grew up during like the Napster era, at a time when I was young and dumb enough to actually think that there was nothing wrong with that, with downloading music. And it took a little bit for me to actually understand that. And I think fonts are kind of the same way. The idea of paying for fonts, paying for a font license is very foreign to many people. And I think that's to be expected. Type is so fundamental in our everyday lives. We see it whenever we walk down the street and on signs, when we're driving, when we go to the store, when we're getting coffee at a coffee shop. So it definitely infiltrates every part of your life.
Yeah. And I especially think about it in the context of knowing type designers and understanding the amount of work that goes into designing a full typeface family.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. And I think one of the reasons there's so much confusion around font licensing is because fonts are considered software, the same as any other application that you use, but they're licensed very differently from other types of software. They're licensed more similarly to images or other artwork, which is weird.
Yeah. So walk me and our listeners through, an example of using a font, just to kind of like level set around that.
So let's maybe work through a simple font use scenario.
Okay.
So it was just Girl Scout cookie season. Hope everyone stocked up. Let's say, I need to make a flyer for selling my niece's Girl Scout cookies. So I get into Microsoft Word, choose a font, type the words that I need to say, print out 100 flyers, and I'm done. That's one use case, right?
And I think the key there is that you are using font software that came installed on your computer, right?
Yep. Times New Roman, Arial, Tahoma, whatever is available to me. And I choose the perfect font to express my niece's Girl Scout cookie sale. So that's a very niche, consumer-focused scenario. But let's say I'm designing an identity for the Met Gala in New York. That's where font licensing looks different and gets more complicated than something you print off from your inkjet printer, right? We're talking about the invitations, a lot of collateral, giant banners, a website, menus, napkins, all of these materials that all have to be designed with a unified type strategy. And those uses of fonts, you can't get that from just using Microsoft Word. So that font license for the Met Gala project is going to look very different from the Girl Scout project because it's a much larger project and involves a lot more money. There are other important reasons too, and that's why we're talking about it today.
All right, well, I don't know about you, but I'm ready to dive in. So let's go. Okay, Phil, before we get deeper into this episode, we need to take a step back and deal with some jargon. There are a couple of terms that people use when they talk about what is essentially the paperwork that comes with a font. A very common term is EULA, an end user license agreement. And then sometimes people just say font license. So my question for you is, are they the same? And if not, do the differences matter?
Well, they're not the same, but the differences probably don't matter, at least for us right now. For us, when talking about licensing fonts or fonts in general, using fonts, a lot of terms come up. Like you said, EULA, end user license agreement, font license, two terms that we'll throw around. We may throw around other terms, but the goal is really to just describe the paperwork that tells the person using the font what they can and can't do with it.
So for all practical purposes, it's fair to say that a EULA, a font license, accomplish the same thing for 99% of the people listening to this episode.
Yeah, for sure. It's kind of like if you look at satellite images of the Earth, like if you zoom out far enough and you look at New York and Chicago, they probably look the same. But when you get closer in, the details start to matter. So for our conversation, we're way far up. So there's not really a reason to distinguish those different terms.
Sure. And it's interesting. We were talking with our producers before recording, trying to workshop this explanation. And we noted that within the world of type, there's a similar double use of words where people will use font and typeface somewhat interchangeably. Now, they mean different things, quite different things. A font is a specific instance of a typeface, but in general conversation and for practical purposes in just kind of discussion, they're often used the same way. So with that out of the way, let's get into some history. We're not going to go all the way back to the period of lead type, wood type, hot metal casting, etc. We're going to actually go back to the mid 80s, which is a major inflection point in the use of fonts that kind of kicked off the modern licensing era. So why don't you tell us a bit about that?
The 80s are fascinating. Before computers were everywhere, computers were these very centralized places. And if you wanted to use a font, you had to go to a specialty shop, a print shop that used very specific equipment. Often a machine-specific formatted font had to be installed on a giant printer. And that's what's used to produce your content. So in the 80s, that's when we saw the emergence of desktop publishing. Computers became much more prevalent for consumers. Now in the 80s or the early 90s, when more and more people have a computer on their desk, they're also seeing more fonts. They're exposed to more typeface designs through programs like Microsoft Office, and they're starting to use fonts differently than how they were in the past. And we've actually created now a consumer market for fonts that didn't exist before.
Yeah, prior to the advent of the home computer, like you're saying, the end user of fonts were printers. With the desktop, the home desktop computer, all of a sudden, moms, dads, and students became the end users. And so now all of a sudden you have a proliferation of the use of fonts that's happening in homes around the world and not just in these highly specialized print shops.
It just takes one click to make your work look twice as good. Microsoft Word, the word processor for Windows.
Another really interesting thing, when we started transitioning from these very specialized print shop settings to more consumer-based printing, you saw licenses being broken down. Like there's a license that's geared towards proofing, and then there's a license that's still geared towards the professional to really keep your core customer base happy, make sure that they have everything they need to run these professional commercial print shops, but also kind of seeding that market with these new consumers that are actually able to realize the benefit of fonts in a way they hadn't been able to before.
Okay, so what you're saying is that when the printing technology changed, font licenses changed with it?
Yeah.
So hobbyist printers and like people printing out Girl Scout cookie flyers at home could get access to fonts on a less expensive license than businesses who were printing in high volume.
That's exactly right.
Well, and that's interesting. I think that idea of realizing the benefit of fonts also just speaks to the way that home desktop computers brought fonts to sort of like the collective consciousness of ordinary people. I think anyone who's sort of a millennial or younger basically grew up using fonts. And I think most of us can remember using fonts to try to manipulate the length of our school assignments so that we could fill up the required 5 pages with what was probably more like 4 1/4 pages of actual work.
No way.
Guilty.
For sure. Me too. I always played with those margins. And I think in the legal field, we learned pretty quickly that Courier New takes up a ton of space.
Yes. Yeah. And then teachers got wise and started requiring Times New Roman and the jig was up. Okay, so essentially we went from a world where font usage was limited to a small population of specialized businesses like printers and publishers to a world where anyone could be a printer or publisher in their own home. So I'm wondering, why does this history matter? What does it tell us about font licensing?
It's important to understand that when you as a consumer are using a TrueType file on your computer, an OpenType file on your computer, this is the end of a very long journey that started before Gutenberg, and knowing where you are in that journey is important for context. It's also important to think about who's actually benefiting from fonts, who's using fonts, how are they being used? And that informs some of the weird quirks of font licensing. So we have the situation where the industry user base for fonts and typeface has shifted through the years and has opened up dramatically from a very specialized skill set, very concentrated skill set, to more of a democratization. Anyone has access to fonts now. Anyone can design with them, but not everyone gets the same value. So, we had this industry pre-consumer use of fonts that was thriving, right? We had designers that were designing, engineers that were engineering, whether that was software, metal, whatever the carrier was for the design. And we had users, in the beginning, very specialized users. All we're doing is broadening that out and saying that a consumer who uses a particular font on their computer, on their desk, is probably not getting the same value as someone whose business is taking in work from people and printing out invitations and collateral and professional materials.
And so what you're describing starts to get at the difference between the Met Gala, which we were talking about earlier, and something like a Girl Scout cookie sale. For the Met Gala, you're getting so much more value out of the fonts you're using, and so your obligation to use them responsibly grows commensurate to that value.
100%.
Okay, so clearly the desktop computer was the first major inflection point in the modern era in terms of how people used fonts. But it wasn't the last, because about 15, 20 years later, we got the internet.
Welcome. You've got mail.
Forget about printing things in your living room. Now people could publish things to the web that could be viewed by anyone, anywhere, anytime, which led to sort of the second great exponential proliferation of fonts in the wild. So, Phil, talk about what that did to this industry and this concept of licensing.
Yeah, completely. And one of the cool things about the font industry or the type industry is it follows all these technological leaps in information dissemination. So, like we talked about the history, from the press to these big commercial printers to desktop computers. And then with the internet, like you can have your own branding identity virtually in a digital environment. And with fonts, we're following along with that. Like, what's the best way to give that visual voice to branding in any environment in which words are displayed? And that's one of the big reasons why we see font licenses splinter off a little bit differently than other types of software licenses. Before computing, we had essentially one customer base. And as technology expands, suddenly there are all these different consumers, all these different users, and all these different use cases that all need to be accounted for.
Yeah. And I mean, basically from the moment we wake up to the moment we sleep, we've got screens in our faces with fonts, screens in our cars, we've got phones in our pockets. People are still reading books and newspapers and magazines. People are buying VR headsets, and every single one of these applications uses fonts.
Wow.
And that just expands the number of environments that need a license. So how has the legal world sort of adapted and kept up with all of this rapid change and tried to keep some semblance of structure around this exploding industry?
We've seen a lot of different changes and a lot of adaptations in the legal industry. Forgetting that we're talking about fonts, the legal industry has seen tremendous changes in the way that contracts are concluded, the way that contracts are enforced. All of these ways that people are binding themselves to certain obligations to connect with people, across geographies is relatively new. And the font industry has certainly grown with that. The advent of desktop publishing coincided with another use case for contracts: click-through or click-wrap contracts or shrink-wrap contracts. Fonts, believe it or not, used to be sold on CDs or floppy disks under shrink-wrap agreements. Up until like the 80s, the 90s, contracts were concluded by both parties signing their name or, some kind of physical thing on generally a piece of paper. Now, any particular font user could be wanting to install the font on a server to display content for millions of users of their website. They could be wanting to take that font and put it into a video game. As we sell commercial software, you want the consumer to be bound by terms related to it before they actually access it. So you need the consumer to know what the terms are and be able to accept them without actually seeing the product. And the shrink wrap licenses are a way around that. You put the license terms on the outside of the product so that when the consumer goes to the point of sale, they read that and there's a seal over the box that says, if you break this seal, you're agreeing to terms. Click-through agreements are exactly the same thing.
So that makes sense to me, Phil, because I'm a 90s kid. And it's funny because I can vividly remember getting SimCity as a kid and eagerly tearing the plastic off and maybe even breaking a sticker that was holding it closed. And what you're saying is that all of the clicking and agreeing that we do to online now is essentially the same as opening that box, taking the disc out and putting it in the computer.
So yeah, exactly. Instead of cutting a sticker or removing a sticker, you're clicking a box. There's a lot of debate about how do you know that the person that checks a box or that writes their name is actually the person they purport to be. How do you know that you've actually gotten assent? How do you know that the terms are the same? All of these problems that crop up with technology, they impact the font industry too. So we have these unique problems where we're dealing with these technological shifts, and the industry and our market has expanded and the breadth of our consumers have grown dramatically. All of these use cases are different, all of the deployment methods are different, and we have to account for the technology side as well as the very font-specific issues.
I mean, that doesn't sound complicated at all.
There's nothing complicated about fonts.
In the next episode, we're going to get more into detail about what's included in your typical font license. But all of these different use cases and complexities and considerations kind of leads me to the last question I have for this part of our story. Who regulates any of this? Is there a government entity? Is it all just kind of hashed out through courts? Who's in charge of this whole mess?
Well, like any good lawyer, I'm going to tell you, it depends.
We have sort of a problem here.
There are multiple bodies that govern different pieces of this. So I'm a lawyer in the U.S. based in Chicago. Contract law in the U.S. is state-based. So Illinois has a different set of laws that pertain to contracts versus Massachusetts versus Washington, Oregon, California. If you get beyond the U.S., it's exactly the same thing. There are government bodies that govern all the requirements related to contracts. We would definitely be drafting very differently if we knew that our consumer was a very specific type of persona based in England versus Chile. Thankfully, there are some common areas that kind of go across basically all geographies. So when we're drafting font licenses or any kind of contract, the first step is trying to understand where will this be used? Who are the regulators that have a say in this? And that's when we start to draft. I wish I had a simple answer for you, but it really is, it depends.
Yeah.
Well, answers like that confirm and validate my decision to not go to law school, but also leaves me feeling grateful that people like you did, because I don't think I could navigate that world very well. Glad we have you. Because this series is going to continue into part 2. On this episode, we've learned what makes a license a license. We've dug in a bit to the history of how we got to the current state and sort of scratched the surface of all the complexity that modern font users need to navigate. But on the next episode of Behind the Font, we'll get into some of the nuts and bolts of what's contained in a license, what it allows you to do, and what you need to understand when you're reading one. And we will leave, once again, grateful that people like Phil did go to law school. Phil, thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.
Anytime.
Thank you for joining us. This is a new episode format for us here at Monotype, so we really appreciate you giving it a listen and kind of coming along on this experiment with us. We do want to answer questions from listeners, so if you have any questions about font licensing, please send them to podcast@monotype.com. You can email us or record a voice memo of you asking the question and attach that to the email. Let us know if we can use your name in the show, we'd love to give shout outs or, a social handle or something like that. And if you have any feedback, please share that too. The purpose of these episodes in particular is to provide some useful information. So it's important to us that this is valuable and worth your time. So feedback is welcome. Behind the Font is a production of Monotype. It's produced by Christopher Olin and Mia Sullivan. Thank you so much to Phil Carey-Bergren for his wonderful legal expertise and for not using too much jargon.
Yes way, Ted!
We'll see you on the next episode of Behind the Font.